You can stop the dog, but you cannot stop the nightmare that is tearing me apart every minute.
Courthouse security denied veteran entry, with service dog judge's response made headlines. The heavy oak doors of the Richmond County Courthouse slammed shut behind Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, with the finality of a prison sentence leaving him standing on the granite steps in his dress blues while his golden retriever service dog Liberty pressed against his trembling legs. The irony was bitter. He'd fought 3 tours in Afghanistan defending American freedom, only to be denied access to American justice by security guards who treated his PTSD service animal like a courthouse threat. "Sir, no animals allowed in federal buildings, service dog or not," Sergeant Davis had declared with the authority of someone who'd never read the Americans with Disabilities Act or witnessed the kind of psychological breakdown that was now beginning to consume the decorated Marine veteran on the courthouse steps. Inside, Judge Patricia Coleman was reviewing the disability case that would determine whether Michael received the benefits he'd earned through combat service. What she didn't know was that justice was about to require her to leave the bench and personally intervene in a civil rights violation happening right outside her courtroom. Richmond County Courthouse, Virginia, 2025. The imposing federal building had served as the seat of justice for 87 years, its classical architecture symbolizing the stability and authority of American law. But the building's security protocols had been designed for a post-9/11 world where threats were external and obvious, not for an era where disabled veterans needed accommodation to access the civil rights their service had defended. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres embodied the invisible wounds that modern warfare inflicted on America's finest soldiers. At 31, he carried the physical scars of 3 IED explosions and the psychological trauma of losing 7 Marines under his command during a Taliban ambush in Helmand Province. The Bronze Star with V device and Purple Heart ribbons on his dress uniform told only part of his story, the visible proof of heroism that couldn't capture the nightmares, hypervigilance, and panic attacks that made civilian life a daily battle for survival. Liberty represented 2 years of intensive training and a $35,000 investment in cutting-edge therapeutic intervention, her golden retriever genetics specifically selected for the temperament and intelligence required for psychiatric service work. Her tasks included interrupting Michael's nightmares, creating physical barriers during panic attacks, retrieving medications during PTSD episodes, and providing the deep pressure therapy that prevented his condition from escalating to the point where hospitalization became necessary. Their partnership had been forged through months of training that taught them to function as a single unit, with Liberty's alerts often providing the only warning Michael received before psychological symptoms overwhelmed his coping mechanisms. The dog's presence wasn't emotional support or companionship. She was medical equipment whose absence could trigger the exact crises that today's court hearing was supposed to address. Judge Patricia Coleman represented the best traditions of American jurisprudence, her 23 years on the federal bench marked by fairness, legal scholarship, and unwavering commitment to constitutional principles. At 58, she had risen from prosecutor to judge through competence and integrity that had earned respect from colleagues and litigants regardless of their political affiliations. Her specialization in veterans' disability cases reflected both professional expertise and personal commitment to serving those who'd served their country. The courthouse security team was led by Sergeant Bill Davis, a former military police officer whose 8 years of federal service had taught him to prioritize threat prevention over accommodation requirements. His training emphasized weapon detection, crowd control, and the kind of rigid adherence to procedures that prevented security breaches but often conflicted with federal disability law that he'd never been properly trained to understand or implement. The broader context was a legal system struggling to balance security concerns with accessibility requirements, where post-9/11 security protocols often conflicted with Americans with Disabilities Act mandates that required accommodation for service animals. Federal courthouses had become fortresses designed to exclude threats, but their security measures sometimes excluded the very citizens whose rights the courts were supposed to protect. Michael's case represented thousands of veterans whose disability claims were trapped in bureaucratic systems that demanded their physical presence, while failing to accommodate the conditions that made such presence difficult or impossible. His PTSD symptoms were severe enough to qualify for total disability benefits, but accessing those benefits required appearing in courtrooms whose security procedures could trigger the exact psychiatric crises that documented his need for assistance. The collision between Michael's accommodation needs and institutional security protocols was building toward a confrontation that would test whether federal disability law meant anything when it conflicted with courthouse procedures and whether the justice system could serve veterans whose service had left them vulnerable to the very institutions designed to protect their rights. The morning had begun with the kind of careful preparation that Michael's military training had taught him to use for high-stress situations. His dress blue uniform was pressed to Marine Corps standards, his service ribbons arranged with precision that reflected pride in achievements that civilian courts needed to understand, and his paperwork organized with the thoroughness that legal proceedings demanded. Liberty wore her official service vest, her documentation folder containing certificates from the Veteran Service Organization that had trained her, and medical letters from Michael's VA psychiatrist detailing her essential role in managing his PTSD symptoms. The disability hearing represented 3 years of bureaucratic struggle to receive benefits that his combat injuries had clearly earned, with medical evidence documenting PTSD symptoms that prevented him from maintaining civilian employment. Today's appearance before Judge Coleman was supposed to be the final step in a process that would provide the financial support he needed while officially recognizing the psychological wounds that his military service had inflicted. "Liberty, let's get this done," Michael whispered to his service dog as they approached the courthouse's main entrance, his voice carrying the determination of someone who'd learned to push through anxiety that would have paralyzed civilian professionals. The Golden Retriever's alert posture indicated that she was already detecting stress indicators that preceded Michael's worst episodes, her training preparing her to provide intervention if his condition deteriorated. The first sign of trouble came when they reached the metal detector checkpoint, where Sergeant Davis immediately focused on Liberty with the kind of suspicion typically reserved for concealed weapons rather than medical equipment. His approach was confrontational from the beginning, suggesting preconceived notions about service animals that conflicted with federal accommodation requirements. "Hold up there, Marine," Davis announced with authority that should have recognized Michael's military status, but instead treated it as irrelevant to courthouse procedures. "You can't bring that dog in here. Federal buildings have strict policies about animals, and I don't care what kind of vest it's wearing." Michael's response was patient and professional, drawing on military training that emphasized following proper channels while asserting legitimate rights. "Sergeant Liberty is my service dog trained to assist with my combat-related PTSD. I have all the required documentation, and federal law guarantees her access to public buildings, including courthouses." The documentation he provided was comprehensive and legally unassailable. Liberty's training certificates, medical necessity letters from his VA treatment team, and federal guidance documents explaining service animal accommodation requirements. The paperwork exceeded what law required while proving the medical relationship that made their separation potentially dangerous for Michael's psychological stability. But Davis's reaction revealed institutional ignorance about disability law that was common among security personnel who'd been trained to exclude rather than accommodate. "I don't care what these papers say. My job is courthouse security, and animals are security risks. You can leave the dog outside or you can leave, period." The confrontation escalated when Davis called for backup, his radio crackling with requests for additional security to deal with what he characterized as a non-compliant individual with an unauthorized animal. The response suggested institutional culture that treated accommodation requests as security threats rather than legal obligations that federal facilities were required to honor. Michael's attempts to explain federal disability law were dismissed with the kind of bureaucratic inflexibility that treated procedures as more important than constitutional rights. Sergeant, the Americans with Disabilities Act specifically protects service animal access to federal buildings. Denying me entry with liberty violates federal civil rights law. The crisis deepened when Davis threatened to have Michael arrested for trespassing if he didn't leave the building, his authority being used to enforce policies that contradicted federal statutes while creating exactly the kind of confrontational environment that Michael's PTSD made unbearable. Liberty's alert behavior indicated that her handler's stress levels were approaching dangerous thresholds that could trigger full psychiatric crisis. The forced separation that followed would test Michael's psychological stability, while demonstrating how institutional ignorance could violate the civil rights of veterans whose service had earned them protection rather than persecution from the government they'd sworn to defend. The forced separation from liberty triggered an immediate and visible deterioration in Michael's condition as the stress of confrontation with authority figures activated PTSD responses that his service dog was trained to interrupt and manage. His breathing became rapid and shallow, his hands began trembling, and his eyes took on the unfocused look of someone whose mind was retreating from present circumstances into combat memories that felt completely real and immediately threatening. "Please, Sergeant, I need liberty to manage my symptoms," Michael pleaded, his voice beginning to show the strain of someone fighting psychological forces beyond conscious control. "She's trained to interrupt panic attacks and prevent me from dissociating. Without her, I could have a complete breakdown." But Davis's response revealed both institutional stubbornness and personal ignorance about PTSD that made him view Michael's distress as manipulation rather than medical emergency. "Son, I've seen plenty of soldiers try to game the system with fake disabilities and therapy pets. You look fine to me, and rules are rules regardless of what sob story you're telling." The insult was both personally devastating and medically dangerous, dismissing Michael's invisible disabilities while triggering exactly the kind of authority figure confrontation that his combat trauma had programmed him to interpret as mortal threat. Liberty's desperate attempts to reach her handler were blocked by security personnel who viewed her anxiety as aggressive behavior rather than professional medical response. The situation escalated when Michael began experiencing the full PTSD episode that Liberty's presence was designed to prevent his military bearing dissolving as he struggled with hypervigilance that transformed the courthouse lobby into a combat zone where uniformed security officers became enemy combatants and every sound suggested incoming threats. "I can't. Liberty, need my dog," Michael gasped between increasingly desperate attempts to breathe. Normally, his words fragmented as present reality merged with Afghan memories of explosions, gunfire, and the deaths of Marines whose loss he'd never learned to process or accept. The courthouse staff's reaction was confusion mixed with growing concern as they witnessed a decorated combat veteran experiencing psychological breakdown that their training had never prepared them to handle. Michael's condition was deteriorating rapidly, while the service dog who could have prevented the crisis was being forcibly restrained outside the building. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a clinical psychologist who was attending her own court hearing, recognized what was happening and immediately intervened with professional medical authority. "This man is experiencing a severe PTSD episode. His service dog isn't a pet. She's medical equipment trained to interrupt exactly what you're witnessing. You need to reunite them immediately." Her intervention should have resolved the crisis, but institutional pride often prevents acknowledgement of error even when consequences become obvious and dangerous. Davis's response was to call for additional security rather than medical assistance, his interpretation of the situation colored by training that viewed disruption as threat rather than disability as medical emergency. The escalation reached critical mass when court officers arrived to find Michael in full psychological crisis, while security personnel continued to prevent his service dog from providing the intervention that her training had prepared her to deliver. The sight of a disabled veteran being denied accommodation while experiencing the exact symptoms that accommodation was designed to prevent created moral outrage among witnesses who understood they were seeing civil rights violation in real time. But the most dramatic intervention was already developing inside the courthouse, where Judge Coleman had been alerted to the disturbance by her bailiff, who recognized that something unprecedented was happening in the lobby. Her initial assumption was routine courthouse disruption, but the description of a veteran being denied entry with his service dog immediately triggered her legal expertise and personal commitment to veterans' rights. What exactly is happening with the veteran and his service dog? Judge Coleman asked her bailiff, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose courtroom experience had taught her to recognize when institutional procedures were conflicting with constitutional obligations. The explanation that followed was both legally troubling and personally offensive to a judge whose specialization in veterans' cases had educated her about service animal accommodation and the consequences of denying disabled veterans access to justice. Her understanding of federal disability law made it clear that courthouse security was violating multiple federal statutes while creating liability that could result in criminal charges and civil penalties. Judge Coleman's decision to personally intervene was unprecedented in courthouse protocol, but legally and morally necessary, as she recognized that justice sometimes required judges to leave their benches and ensure that constitutional rights were protected rather than violated by the institutions designed to serve them. The transformation that was about to occur would demonstrate that judicial authority could be used to protect rather than merely prosecute, that constitutional principles meant nothing without enforcement, and that the strongest legal institutions were those whose leaders understood that their primary obligation was serving the people whose rights they were sworn to protect. The crisis was building toward confrontation between institutional authority and judicial leadership that would test whether federal disability law could overcome bureaucratic ignorance when supported by someone with the power and knowledge to enforce constitutional obligations. The psychiatric crisis reached its peak when Michael collapsed on the courthouse steps, his PTSD episode escalating beyond what conscious willpower could manage, as combat memories overwhelmed his ability to distinguish between past trauma and present reality. Liberty's frantic attempts to reach him were blocked by security personnel who continued to view her distress as threat rather than medical intervention, their ignorance creating exactly the kind of medical emergency that federal disability law was designed to prevent. Contact, medic, Marines down, Michael whispered through labored breathing, his words revealing the mental space he now occupied, where the courthouse steps had become an Afghan battlefield, and security officers had transformed into hostile forces, threatening his survival. The dissociative episode was complete and dangerous, with his psychological state deteriorating toward levels that typically required psychiatric hospitalization. Dr. Mitchell's attempts to provide psychological first aid were hampered by security protocols that prevented civilians from approaching someone who was being treated as security threat rather than medical emergency. Her professional assessment was grim. This veteran is experiencing severe psychiatric crisis that could result in complete psychological breakdown if his service dog isn't allowed to provide intervention. Every minute of delay increases the risk of permanent psychological damage. But Sergeant Davis's commitment to courthouse procedures was overriding medical necessity and legal obligation, his authority being used to enforce policies that were creating federal civil rights violations while endangering a disabled veteran's life. Ma'am, I don't care what kind of doctor you are. My job is courthouse security, and I'm not changing procedures because one person is having an emotional breakdown. The darkest moment came when Michael began calling out the names of Marines who had died under his command, his psychological regression complete as present circumstances triggered survivor guilt that had been festering for years without proper resolution. The decorated veteran who had earned his ribbons through courage under fire was now completely vulnerable to memories that his service dog was trained to interrupt and manage. Rodriguez, get down. Incoming. Michael cried out, his voice carrying the desperation of someone reliving moments when his leadership decisions had meant life or death for the men under his command. The combat memories were so vivid that courthouse observers could see him mentally ducking incoming fire that existed only in traumatic recall, but felt completely real to his damaged psyche. The witness testimony that was developing among courthouse visitors would later prove crucial for civil rights litigation, with multiple people documenting how a disabled veteran's accommodation rights were being violated while he experienced the exact medical crisis that federal law was designed to prevent. The video evidence being captured on cell phones would become legal documentation of systematic discrimination against disabled veterans. The institutional failure was complete and devastating, as courthouse staff struggled with protocols that had never contemplated the consequences of denying medical accommodation to someone whose disability could manifest in psychiatric emergencies. Michael's condition was proving the necessity of service animal accommodation, while the denial of that accommodation was creating liability that could destroy careers and cost taxpayers millions in civil rights settlements. The personal tragedy was equally profound, as Michael faced the complete collapse of psychological defenses that years of therapy and medical treatment had built. His coping mechanisms overwhelmed by institutional confrontation that triggered every trauma response his military service had programmed into his nervous system. The man who had led Marines through combat was now helpless against memories that felt more real than his present circumstances. The legal crisis was building as courthouse security's actions were creating federal civil rights violations that could result in Department of Justice investigation and criminal charges against individual officers who had willfully denied accommodation to a disabled veteran. The institutional liability was staggering, with federal law providing both civil and criminal penalties for violations that were being documented by multiple witnesses. The moral failure was perhaps most devastating, as a government institution that claimed to serve veterans was instead traumatizing someone whose military service had earned him protection rather than persecution. The courthouse that was supposed to provide justice was instead denying basic human dignity to someone whose sacrifice had defended the constitutional principles that his treatment was violating. The crisis was complete. A disabled veteran was experiencing life-threatening psychiatric emergency because government employees had violated federal law while his service dog, trained to provide life-saving medical intervention, was being forcibly prevented from performing the tasks that could restore his stability and prevent permanent psychological damage. The intervention that was about to occur would test whether judicial authority could overcome institutional ignorance, and whether constitutional principles meant anything when they conflicted with bureaucratic procedures enforced by people who had never learned the difference between security and discrimination. The transformation began when Judge Patricia Coleman emerged from the courthouse with the kind of commanding presence that 23 years on the federal bench had taught her to project when constitutional principles were under attack. Her black robes billowed as she descended the courthouse steps, her expression carrying the authority of someone whose judicial oath had prepared her for exactly this kind of moment when justice required personal intervention rather than procedural detachment. "What is the meaning of this?" Judge Coleman demanded as she surveyed the scene, a disabled veteran in full psychiatric crisis, a service dog being restrained by security personnel and courthouse staff, who clearly had no understanding of the federal civil rights violations they were committing. Her voice carried the kind of authority that made federal marshals stand at attention and attorneys reconsider their arguments. Sergeant Davis's response revealed both his ignorance of judicial authority and his continued commitment to procedures that were violating federal law. "Your Honor, we're just following courthouse security protocols. This individual refused to comply with our no animals policy, and now he's creating a disturbance that threatens building security. The judge's reaction was swift and educational, her legal expertise providing context that transformed the situation from security issue to constitutional crisis. Sergeant Davis, you are currently violating the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and federal civil rights statutes that protect service animal access to public buildings. This Marine service dog is medical equipment, not a security threat. But Judge Coleman's intervention went beyond legal education to encompass immediate medical necessity, as she recognized that Michael's psychological crisis required the kind of intervention that only liberty could provide. Her understanding of PTSD and service animal partnerships allowed her to see what security personnel had missed, that continued separation was creating exactly the medical emergency that accommodation was designed to prevent. Officer, release that service dog immediately and allow her to reach her handler. Judge Coleman commanded with judicial authority that brooked no argument. Every second of delay is creating additional liability for this courthouse and additional trauma for a decorated combat veteran whose rights you have systematically violated. The reunion between Michael and Liberty was immediate and therapeutically essential, with the Golden Retriever's training asserting itself as she provided deep pressure therapy and grounding techniques that began interrupting his PTSD episode. The transformation was visible and medically documented by Dr. Mitchell, whose professional expertise could verify the service dog's effectiveness in managing psychiatric symptoms. Liberty, good girl, I'm here. We're safe, Michael whispered, as his service dog's intervention began working her presence, providing the psychological anchor that allowed him to begin distinguishing between combat memories and present reality. The change was gradual but unmistakable as his breathing normalized and his awareness of current circumstances began returning. Judge Coleman's next actions were both legally decisive and personally meaningful as she addressed the broader institutional failures that had created the crisis. Sergeant Davis, you and your staff will report to my chambers immediately for emergency training on federal disability law and service animal accommodation. This courthouse will never again deny access to disabled veterans seeking justice. The education that followed was comprehensive and mandatory, with Judge Coleman providing courthouse security with detailed instruction about ADA requirements, service animal law, and the constitutional obligations that federal facilities had toward disabled citizens. The training was immediate and practical, ensuring that similar violations would not occur while establishing accountability for staff whose ignorance could no longer be excused. The legal implications were addressed with equal seriousness as Judge Coleman documented the civil rights violations for potential Department of Justice review, while ensuring that Michael's accommodation needs would be fully met during his disability hearing. The judicial intervention was both corrective and protective, demonstrating how constitutional authority could be used to enforce rather than merely interpret federal law. But the most meaningful resolution was personal rather than institutional, with Judge Coleman's direct involvement validating Michael's service while demonstrating that the justice system could protect rather than persecute veterans whose disabilities required accommodation. Her intervention proved that constitutional principles meant something when enforced by people who understood their obligations to serve rather than obstruct. The disability hearing that followed was conducted with full accommodation for Michael and Liberty, their partnership demonstrating the medical necessity that courthouse security had failed to recognize. Judge Coleman's ruling was comprehensive and favorable, awarding maximum disability benefits while documenting the service-connected nature of Michael's PTSD and his need for service animal accommodation. The policy changes that resulted were immediate and far-reaching, with the courthouse implementing new procedures that prioritized accommodation over exclusion, while training all staff on federal disability law and veterans' rights. The changes influenced federal courthouse operations nationwide as other districts adopted similar policies to avoid the liability and embarrassment that Richmond County had experienced. The media coverage was extensive and largely positive, focusing on Judge Coleman's decisive intervention while highlighting the broader issues of veteran accommodation and civil rights enforcement. The coverage educated the public about service animal partnerships, while demonstrating how individual courage could overcome institutional ignorance when supported by proper authority and legal knowledge. The recognition that followed was both professional and personal, with Judge Coleman receiving awards from veterans organizations and disability rights groups, while being recognized by judicial colleagues for her commitment to constitutional principles over bureaucratic convenience. The recognition validated her belief that judges serve justice rather than institutions. The broader impact extended throughout the federal court system as the Richmond County incident became a case study in disability rights enforcement and judicial leadership. Law schools incorporated the case into their curricula about constitutional law and judicial ethics, while judicial training programs used Judge Coleman's intervention as an example of proper response to civil rights violations. Michael's recovery was gradual but complete, his psychological stability restored through proper medical treatment, and a kind of institutional respect that his service had earned but had been denied until Judge Coleman's intervention. His disability benefits provided financial security, while his experience became advocacy opportunity for other veterans facing similar accommodation challenges. The annual Judge Patricia Coleman Veterans Rights Award became the federal judiciary's premier recognition for judges who demonstrated exceptional commitment to protecting veterans' constitutional rights. The award influenced judicial behavior throughout the federal system while inspiring similar recognition programs in state courts. 5 years later, the Richmond County Courthouse had become a model for disability accommodation and veteran services, with staff trained to recognize and support rather than obstruct the rights of disabled citizens seeking justice. The transformation proved that institutional change was possible when leadership understood that serving justice meant serving all citizens equally. The final scene was both vindication and new beginning. Judge Coleman stood beside Michael and Liberty at the courthouse entrance where the crisis had occurred, unveiling a memorial plaque that honored all veterans while committing the institution to protecting the rights of those who had protected America's freedoms. Justice isn't just about what happens inside courtrooms, Judge Coleman reflected during the dedication ceremony. Sometimes, justice requires us to step outside our comfort zones and ensure that constitutional principles are protected wherever they're threatened. Today, we remember that service never ends. It just takes different forms as we continue protecting the rights that veterans fought to preserve. The Richmond County Courthouse incident became a watershed moment for federal disability rights enforcement and judicial responsibility, establishing legal precedents and training requirements that transformed how courts throughout America approached service animal accommodation and veterans' rights. Judge Coleman's decisive intervention influenced federal judicial policy while creating standards that protected thousands of disabled veterans from discrimination. The immediate consequences revolutionized courthouse operations nationwide, with the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts implementing mandatory disability rights training for all federal courthouse personnel within 6 months. The program reached over 50,000 employees, while preventing countless future incidents through enhanced understanding of accommodation requirements and constitutional obligations. The Department of Justice investigation that followed resulted in comprehensive reforms to federal building security protocols, establishing the first national standards for service animal accommodation in government facilities. The investigation led to criminal charges against courthouse security personnel who had willfully violated federal disability law while creating civil liability that cost taxpayers over $2 million in settlements and legal fees. The legal precedents established through Judge Coleman's intervention strengthened enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act throughout the federal court system. The precedents influenced major civil rights decisions while providing legal framework for disability rights enforcement that had been missing from previous judicial interpretations. The federal legislation that resulted included the Veterans Courthouse Access Act, which created specific protections for service animal teams in judicial proceedings while establishing criminal penalties for government employees who violated accommodation requirements. The law influenced state legislation and private sector policies that extended similar protections beyond federal facilities. The judicial training revolution extended to all federal courts as the Federal Judicial Center developed comprehensive disability rights curricula based on lessons learned from the Richmond County case. Judge Coleman's intervention became required study for federal judges while influencing judicial ethics training that emphasized constitutional obligations over procedural convenience. The veterans' rights movement gained national momentum through Michael's case, with new legislation strengthening federal protections for service animal teams while increasing penalties for discrimination. The case influenced Veterans Affairs policies and community programs that recognized service animals as essential medical equipment rather than accommodation requests. The cultural impact transformed public understanding of judicial responsibility and constitutional enforcement, with Judge Coleman's story demonstrating that constitutional principles required active protection rather than passive interpretation. The case inspired broader conversations about institutional accountability and the obligation government employees owed to citizens whose rights they were sworn to protect. The research that emerged from documenting the incident's aftermath influenced academic understanding of disability rights enforcement and judicial leadership. Peer-reviewed studies validated the effectiveness of immediate intervention and comprehensive training, while demonstrating that institutional change was possible when supported by leadership commitment and legal accountability. The enduring message transcended individual heroism to encompass fundamental truths about American justice, constitutional rights, meant nothing without enforcement. Judicial authority carried obligations to protect rather than merely interpret law. And the strongest institutions were those that served all citizens equally, regardless of disability, military status, or accommodation needs.